Okay, so I had said I would have a follow-up video, and this is going to be that. It was actually really interesting to look at the way that things played out in Week 18 and see the alternate timelines because I've discovered that my principles that I gleaned, which, as a reminder, are these, um, turns out not to quite be right. And everyone complaining that Cincinnati got screwed, I think you actually have a point. And I'm going to go ahead and explain why. I don't quite understand exactly what the NFL is doing here. So, as a reminder, when I looked at what the NFL had proposed prior to the Week 18 games, this is what I had inferred that their rules were, which is that when there's a canceled game, you look at alternate timeline standings based on what could have been the results of that canceled game. And then if there's disagreement between which team is seated higher, then you alter home field based on that. So that if there's disagreement, you either have a coin toss or have the game at a neutral site. Um, and I'll show in just a second. That turns out not to be right. So, as a reminder, what the NFL announced, they announced a number of scenarios that would create a neutral site AFC Championship game, and one of those is still in play. And they also announced a scenario where a first round playoff matchup between Baltimore and Cincinnati, the site of the game would have been determined by a coin toss. That is not in play anymore because, as it turns out, um, Cincinnati beat Baltimore in Week 18. So there's no alternate timeline scenario in which Baltimore would have ended up seated higher than Cincinnati. So they are, in fact, going to play each other next week, but the game is going to be in Cincinnati with no coin toss needed. One interesting thing I wonder is why a coin toss? Why not have considered having that game at a neutral site, perhaps in Pittsburgh, which would seem to be an obvious place to do it. Maybe the stadium there is just not available. I don't know. But anyways, so as a reminder, if Baltimore had beaten Cincinnati, they would have finished 11-6, and Cincinnati would have finished 11-5. So Cincinnati still would have had the higher seed, but because there would have been an alternate timeline scenario where Baltimore would have had the higher seed, they were going to decide the home field for that game on a coin toss. So that was a potentially interesting scenario that's not coming through. Now that's the alternate timeline I'm looking at. Sorry, here's the real timeline. Okay, so yeah, Cincinnati would have been 11-5, and Baltimore would have been 11-6. So yes, that is that scenario. Now here, these are the real standings here. So as you can see, Kansas City finished 14-3, and Buffalo finished 13-3. And one of my friends pointed out, well, gee, Buffalo is the one that really gets screwed. I agree. Buffalo is totally screwed, but I would claim that Buffalo was screwed by the scenario, by the situation, not necessarily by anything that the NFL did. However, Cincinnati, I'm going to show you, is still being screwed by a decision by the NFL. I already explained that they put that Baltimore situation in there for the coin toss. But if you take a look at the alternate timeline where Cincinnati had won the game against Buffalo, right? So imagine if the Cincinnati-Buffalo game had finished and Cincinnati had won that game. This is what the standings would have looked like. And what I find especially interesting, you compare this to the real standings. In the real standings, Buffalo is number 2, and Cincinnati is number 3. So Buffalo has the higher seed. But in this alternate timeline scenario, Cincinnati is 2 and Buffalo is number 3, which means Cincinnati would have been the higher seed. So this is a situation, Cincinnati and Buffalo, where there is disagreement between the different timeline scenarios about who would be the higher seed. So if the rules that I had inferred were in fact correct, then a playoff game between Cincinnati and Buffalo should either be determined, the location of such a game should either be determined by a coin toss or it should be at a neutral site. Yet no such plan has been announced or implemented, nor do I think it's going to happen, from the NFL. It looks to me, as far as I can tell, that a game between Buffalo and Cincinnati in the playoffs will be played in Buffalo because Buffalo is the higher seed. I find this very odd. Why is it that they would stick with Buffalo as the site for that game? But if Baltimore had beaten Cincinnati in that last week of the season, then the playoff game between Baltimore and Cincinnati would have been done by a coin toss. And then why is it that AFC Championship game between Buffalo and Cincinnati is at a neutral site. Like, I understand all of those. The alternate timelines say that there was an alternate timeline where Buffalo could have had the number one seed, right? So that's why a AFC Championship game between Buffalo and Cincinnati goes to a neutral site. I get that. But there's also an alternate timeline where Cincinnati would have been seated higher than Buffalo. So a playoff game between Buffalo and Cincinnati should either be at a neutral site or it should be determined by a coin toss. Now, a playoff game between Buffalo and Cincinnati would occur in the divisional round, the second round of the playoffs. If both Buffalo and Cincinnati win next week, then there will be a playoff game between Buffalo and Cincinnati. And as I understand it, that game is going to be played in Buffalo, not determined by a coin toss and not at a neutral site. I find that very odd. For one thing, by the way, there's a perfect neutral site to hold that game in Cleveland. That would be pretty awesome. It's a reasonable drive for fans from both cities. You could give half the stadium to season ticket holders from one team and half from the other, and they'd all drive, and you'd have a really awesome and unique atmosphere if that game comes to fruition, if they could have had it in Cleveland. Now, I have no idea if the logistics allow the stadium to be available at that time or not. I don't know any of that. But that would have been kind of cool. But at least they should have been having a coin toss based on the precedent that they had announced had Baltimore beaten Cincinnati. But they're not. If I had to guess at what is the NFL thinking here, it seems like they just wanted to make the Week 18 game between Cincinnati and Baltimore be meaningful, because if they had just gone straight by seedings, then that game would have not affected anything. But by announcing the coin toss scenario, now it caused that game to be meaningful. And yeah, you could certainly argue that had the game with Buffalo gone through to completion, then Cincinnati would have needed to take care of business against Buffalo in order for that game to be not meaningful, the game against Baltimore. They didn't take care of business against Buffalo because the game got canceled, so therefore they need to take care of business against Baltimore. That's actually not too unreasonable, but still, I just don't understand why it is that a potential playoff game between Buffalo and Cincinnati is simply going to the higher seed and not looking at this alternate timeline scenario, the one where what if Cincinnati had beaten Buffalo in Week 17, the game that was canceled. If that had been the case, then Cincinnati would have gotten the number 2 seed and would have ended up hosting the game. In the actual standings, Buffalo has finished, Buffalo has finished at 13-3 and Cincinnati at 12-4. Yeah, so Buffalo has finished one game ahead of Cincinnati. But if Cincinnati had won, they would have finished with the same record, but Cincinnati would have won head-to-head, so Cincinnati would have had the tiebreaker. So therefore, the location of a potential Buffalo-Cincinnati game is ambiguous across these timelines. So I just don't get it. That a divisional round playoff game between Buffalo and Cincinnati should be either a coin toss location or a neutral site location. And I don't know why they wouldn't just do it in Cleveland. But as far as I know, there's no plans and has been no discussion to do it that way. They are simply going to put the game in Buffalo, with Buffalo being the higher seed. Like I say, I find that to be a very odd thing. Maybe because it's Buffalo and Cincinnati and they were the two teams involved in the canceled game, they can argue that, hey, that affects both of the teams equally, and Cincinnati did end up a game behind Buffalo. Maybe that's what they're thinking. I don't really know. But anyways, yeah, I think that Buffalo is screwed by the situation, and I don't think that there's a whole lot that could have been done about that. But Cincinnati's been screwed twice now. I don't think people realize the second one, but Cincinnati has been screwed twice by NFL decisions. Once with the decision that, yes, we're going to have a coin toss if they don't win against Baltimore in Week 18. Turns out they did win in Week 18, so that coin toss isn't happening. But now again, with a potential second round matchup against Buffalo, which, based on what I thought the NFL was doing, should have been a neutral site or coin toss, but instead is going to be held in Buffalo, with Buffalo being the higher seed. So I think I've said the same thing over and over again a few times. Talking quickly about what could the NFL have done to screw over Buffalo less? There's not much that they could have done. The wacky things that they could have considered would have been, number one, if they would go back to a 6-team playoff, that would fix the problem mostly, because then you would have Buffalo as a first-round bye in addition to Kansas City. And then if you do combine that with the neutral site AFC team, then you basically have kind of co-number 1 seeds there. So you might have considered that to be fair, but of course that screws over the number 7 seed Miami. Now, again, I don't think there should be a number 7 seed, but there is, so that's the world we live in. The other wacky thing you could have tried to do would be to add in a number 8 seed so that no one gets a first round bye and everyone has to play, and that seems kind of fair. In this case, that would be Pittsburgh that would have jumped in as the number 8 seed. Again, those are wacky, wild things that I'm sure weren't considered and probably would be a logistical nightmare to do. So, oh well. Yeah, like I say, Buffalo is screwed by the situation. I just don't think there's much that could have been done about it. But Cincinnati has been screwed by the NFL's decisions that they would have to coin toss when they were ahead in the standings. They have to coin toss with Baltimore, but when they're behind in the standings, no, and then we go by seeding. Right? It seems very, very odd to me. So I think the Cincinnati players and fans that are complaining about the NFL's decision actually have a legit gripe, and I think it's worse than people realize because of the way that this potential 2 versus 3 Buffalo versus Cincinnati game in the divisional round uh, is being handled, which is that they're just going by seeding. So, anyways, yeah, that's the situation. I don't know that there's any decent precedent or any understanding of how the NFL could or should handle these situations in the future. I find the whole decision a little bit weird. To me, I kind of feel like probably what the NFL should have just said is the game is canceled and we're sorry. We know some teams are screwed by this, but this is just life, and then just moved on with the seeding the way that it is. Like I say, I think they were trying to make that Cincinnati-Baltimore game in Week 18 meaningful. So, yeah, that's that. A little bit weird, I think. Here's the real standings as the season actually finished. Here's alternate timeline number 1 with a Buffalo win. So you see Buffalo lost their chance at the number 1 seed in the first round bye. And then here is alternate timeline number 2 with a Cincinnati win, where Cincinnati would have finished ahead of Buffalo and gotten the right to host that potential divisional game. So anyways, I welcome comments. I'm interested in what everyone has to think about these sorts of things. You think the NFL screwed over Cincinnati by their decisions? Do you think that there's a better way that this could have been done? How do you think such situations should be handled in the future? I mean, is it even worth thinking about? When's the next time we're ever going to have a canceled game? It's unbelievably rare. I honestly don't ever remember it happening in my lifetime. The only other time I remember there being games similarly, quote unquote, well, obviously there was the 2020 season with COVID, so they really moved things around a lot there. And then and then the only other time was in 2001 after 9/11. But in that case, they canceled an entire week of games all at once, and then just took that whole week and moved it to the end of the season and shifted the playoffs. And it affected the entire league in that way. So yeah, it may not even be worth bothering to think about this, but the fact that something's unlikely to matter certainly never stopped me from thinking about it. So I'm interested what everyone else has to think. Have a good one.